So welcome back to Wealth 360 and my partnership with my good friend, Michael McFiner. What's happening, my friend?
Not too much. Thanks for having me today, B.
Thanks for joining me in this important conversation. We're going to explore Enneagram 5. We'll get into that in a second, but we're also going to be doing some fun stuff after we finish this recording. Michael and I are both big fans of Ted Lasso. So this is a little teaser for our fan base. We're going to do serious stuff, but we're going to also do some fun stuff. I'm looking forward to that one too.
No, that one's fun, and you promised me we'd also do one on Yellowstone, right?
Yeah, you want a primer on crazy Enneagram 8 Beth Dutton. So we'll get into
Yes,
that.
please,
Um,
please.
yes, it takes one to know one, right? And I'm an 8. So
That's why I thought it'd be perfect for you to give insight into the current season for Beth.
So I think it's fun to mix it up like that because you can learn. I mean, Enneagram it's real life. It's how we live our lives. And so I find that if you watch TV shows or movies and you can use this, it really deepens your experience of the Enneagram. So good way to learn.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to remember, who's
Absolutely.
what. It's a great picture's worth 1,000 words.
And that's why throughout my program, for anybody who engages at Defy Your Number, I've got tons and tons of real-time stuff. I've got movie characters, movies. I've got music genres of each type, and just really some good stuff because it should be serious and help you make better investments, which is what we'll get into. But it also is it's how you navigate life and taking back the reins of your life.
Now, you've been able to apply the Enneagram to just about anything at this point.
Yeah, it is. It's applicable. So, if for anybody listening who didn't listen to my previous podcast without my good friend Michael, I talked about the Enneagram 5. So every week I'm trying to do a general kind of primer of the Enneagram type. And then my partnership with Mick formally around the Enneagram revolves around what we call Wealth 360, which is taking that particular Enneagram type and looking at it through the lens of, well, Michael's expertise of money, finance, investment, all things financial. And so that's what we're going to do here. We're going to continue our journey. We began it 5 weeks ago with Enneagram 1. We've been marching through, and now we are up to the 5. So when I say Enneagram 5, who are we talking about, my friend?
These tend to be people who are thinkers. They, I think, tend to be people who reflect a lot, who analyze, or just you might think of them as intellectuals potentially, or people who ponder subjects analytically. They're not necessarily very emotional people.
So that's why there are different names and different systems. That's why we say the number, because the name can change, but the number is always representative of what Michael's describing. Sometimes I call it in my system the investigator. I could have just as easily called it the thinker. Well, that's a little misleading because everybody thinks, but like Michael's saying, not fives navigate the world first and foremost through analytical processing versus emotional. There's other types that are more emotional based. Last week's conversation, Enneagram 4 is the ultimate emotional emoting type. Right next door, Enneagram 5 is the ultimate thinking type. And so that's absolutely right. It's also why they're both on the bottom of the Enneagram. Is if any of you are watching, you don't have to be watching, but I'm pointing to the Enneagram. And at the bottom, there's 4 and 5, right? And that's because they're the most deep, complicated, complex numbers in the Enneagram. That's why, obviously, 4 plus 5 equals 9. They're a counterbalance to the 9, which is on the top, 9 being the peacemaker, the easygoing, the lighter version. And then down below, you have the sort of the shadow side of the Enneagram. And one is not better than the other. We need access to both, but 5s really help us go into the depths of thinking and analysis. Anything else we want to add big picture to the 5?
I like to think of these as the professorial types, just that I think everyone can relate to. A lot of the Enneagram sometimes it's tough to identify people, as we've discussed, like 6s and other things, but a 5's a 5. When you see a 5, you kind of know a 5.
That's right. Yeah, they're definitive. 6 by definition is kind of ambivalent. They're thinking types, but they're not sure exactly how they think. fives are unequivocal, right? Analytical, pure. Now, there are different variations, there are different subtypes, so not all fives look alike, but you do know, like Michael's saying, when you're around a five, because there is just this, well, five-ish kind of energy that's given off. So we are calling in our Wealth 360 add-on. So remember, I have the Defy Your Number program, and then we have the Wealth 360, which is the Defy Your Number program plus all things financial. And in our system, we're calling the Conservative Investor. I think there were some other names we were grappling with too, but we went with Conservative Investor, which I think is it's a good call. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's maybe conservative in the sense of traditional. It's the traditional investor who are making investments based on analytical information, not on speculative information. So I think that's probably the difference here. They may buy something that's aggressive, but they're doing it based on hard analytical information.
That's a great point. I actually had coffee this week with somebody who's in the financial industry, and they're an Enneagram 5. And they're a sexual 5 for those listening. It just means a little more emotive 5. And they didn't fully resonate with conservative if what we mean by that is not taking risk. But when we started to drill down in our conversation, it didn't take long to get him to realize that he takes risk after a lot of calculation.
There you go. So, and it's funny because you do have a tale of two fives, which I don't even want to go into. You always hit me with the world's worst investors. Thank God Sam, Bankman-Fried isn't a 3, but
he's a 5.
Well, I think, yeah. I'm only mentioning that because the quintessential 3 that I think of, and you hit, when you put the slide together, you put Charlie Munger, but of course I'm thinking Warren Buffett, because Benjamin Graham actually is Warren Buffett's professor when you put Benjamin Graham. So Warren Buffett is exactly that type. I don't know if he's a social or sexual 5 because he's outgoing, he's friendly, but he's Mr. Analytical, right? He wants facts and figures, calculation, projection, cash flows, for that. So right. Yeah, Benjamin Graham and Charlie Munger are Warren Buffett's. One's his professor, one's his partner.
That's right. And Warren Buffett would have been up here, but I moved him down to a primary kind of a showcase.
Yeah, I got scared when I was reading it, saying what happened to Warren Buffett, but then you hit me with a kind of right hook on this when you did the example. And this was new because, as everyone knows, B is an 8, and he works 25 hours a day improving the system. He's, you can't keep up with him, of course, but doing the comparison to Sam Bankman-Fried, which just happened a few weeks ago, is mind-boggling that you put all this together so quickly. But you're so informative and insightful in this analysis.
Well, really wasn't me, because I saw in the headlines, young could be Warren Buffett, aka Sam Bankman-Fried, right? That's how he was kind of the wonderkin, version of Warren Buffett years later. But turns out he went a very different direction. And, for me, it's just a reminder for anybody listening. There's not an Enneagram type that's better or worse. There's a reactive version and there's a responsive, an unconscious, a conscious. And so the work that, Michael and I are so into is helping people ascend to the higher side of their number. You can't change numbers. You don't need to change numbers. Just be the best version of you. Warren Buffett, Sam Bankman-Fried, same type, very different expressions of that type. So let's look at some of the nuts and bolts before we kind of jump in. All right, let's talk about when you think of the 5, what are some core, actually it was this slide here, what are some core attributes that come to the forefront for you?
Well, I think the 5s are thinking about, like you said, conservative protection. They want to make sure, first and foremost, Warren Buffett's rule number 1, don't lose money, is actually his rule number 1.
Right.
Rule number 2, don't forget rule number 1. That's actually his famous quote of his. And I think that speaks to the 5. That's the first thing they're looking at, is protecting your money first. Then once it's protected, you can then look to the growth, which is not necessarily what other parts of the Enneagram do. So the first, they're looking at safety and protection, and then, okay, how do we build? But I think the protection, as you put number 2 in conserve, is the most important factor. They'd rather not make an investment if there's an unreasonable risk to lose the money than to invest it.
So that is absolutely true about a 5 in general, because 5s are there's three there's a triad of Enneagram types that are called the withdrawing types, and that's Enneagram 4, last week's talk, Enneagram 5, and then Enneagram 9. And they withdraw from the world when they're under stress, or when they're, they need time to process. They need time. So they conserve in the sense of conserving, pulling back, right? Not conservative in politics, although I would be interested to know that, because I imagine 5s are more conservative in their political views. They're conservative about everything. They're always pulling back as opposed to, right, charging ahead. Michael and I are the charge ahead kinds.
I think, 5s are very conscientious, and I think people who tend to be conscientious tend to be a little bit more conservative. Mm-hmm. When I think of even politically, the people who tend to be a little more liberal tend to be a little bit more open to things and new experiences. And 5s are traditional in every sense of the word, conservative, traditional, whatever word and adjective you like to use.
Something that I have grappled with in trying to place Warren Buffett and Elon Musk, because they get thrown around between Enneagram 1, the reformer or perfectionist, and Enneagram 5, the investigator. Some people think one is in a 1, and some people think the other one's a 1. And this is one of the confusing kind of mistypes that I experience in working with people. Are they a 1 or are they a 5? Now, they have different motivations, and that's where I put Warren Buffett into the 5, because the motivation of a 1 is to be perfect. The motivation of a 5 is to conserve. And Buffett feels more of that latter, that conservationist. Obviously, you agree with that.
I think that's right. But I think you hit on a very important thing here, which is what is the motivation behind those two, which is a big difference as you relate to investing, right? Mm-hmm. And conserving is a lot different than other things.
One of the reasons why I decided to put Buffett in the 5 is because I was listening to a podcast about him and his passing up investment opportunities in the late 90s. And he basically said he didn't understand it. So that was the first thing, because a 5 would, wants to certainly understand first and foremost. And secondly, because it was too new. Right. And so he withheld. Now, of course, Elon Musk, a very different approach to tech. And so I put him more as a 1. But I guess we've talked about Elon Musk.
Well, you've always taught me that obviously you might score highest in one category, but you could be very close in the next category. So some people are clearly just dominant in one part of the Enneagram.
Right.
Some people might be dominant in a couple of areas, or at least very equal in several areas. So yes. I would suspect, to your point, that Elon Musk might be 5, have just be very close and balanced in 5-1, where Warren Buffett just isn't. He's clearly just, a 5.
So this is what we call your core type. You get one number that's your core type. It really doesn't change. It's your wiring. But our whole type includes the way we think, feel, and act. And so you have really 3 important numbers. You have 1 that's your defining number. But like Michael's talking about, you have, 1 in the triad of thinking, 1 in the triad of feeling, 1 in the triad of action. So Warren Buffett probably thinks like a 5, probably acts like a 1. Whereas I think Elon Musk is a core type 1, but he thinks like a 5. So yes, they're not worlds apart.
I mean, I know dominant 8 and then second to 4, correct?
So I'm a core type, yes, 8. That's my MO. And then I feel like a 4. Last week's conversation.
How far are you off from an 8 versus the 4, like percentage wise? Like I know as a 3, I'm also a 1. Mm-hmm. But there was like 10-point difference in that. Does that make a difference how close you are in the things, or am I overstating? kind of that part of it.
No, I think you're right on. I think it's we're post-election, thank God. Regardless of your politics, at least it's behind us now down in Georgia, and we can move on. And there's a margin of error when you go to the polling booth, right? And I think there's a margin of error too in the Enneagram, but you clearly with that 3-1 difference you're not within a margin of error. Whereas, and I'm not either, to answer your question,
I think.
but I do work with people sometimes where, like they almost tie, or maybe they're just barely ahead, and I feel like
Yeah,
I owe it to them to share both.
and that's what I'm wondering. I think that's why I say Elon Musk, I bet, would be closer to a tie, where Warren Buffett, there's no confusion in there. And I wonder, where people, it's almost like schizophrenia in the sense of they have split personalities. In that sense, it's not definite.
What's interesting too is ones are really driven by a need to be good and be perceived as being good. And I was listening to Warren Buffett in this podcast, or maybe it was an audiobook on him, but his wife said to him, I forget what he was about to purchase. Oh no, it was somebody was just busted, one of the companies he was involved with, and he felt like he needed to take the high moral ground. And she said to him, Warren, you're not a pastor. Like you shouldn't do anything wrong. But that's not you. You're not a pastor. That's not your character. And it kind of hit me. Like he's a good man. I grew up 2 miles from Warren Buffett.
I was to say he's a nice Midwestern boy like you. I mean, it's different in the Midwest, right? You
He's
probably
got
get more of that.
good values. He was, he was a really solid human being. Everybody knows him as being a decent and humble man. But at the end of the day, I was listening to this podcast, and some of the things reminded me he wasn't a one. Not a bad guy, a good guy, but not a one. I don't know. So let's not, we don't get too hung up. This isn't the Warren
No,
Buffett
but it is
podcast.
interesting to know you really have, as you said before, that is an area where you may be dominant in, but you have, pieces of the other areas in you, and it depends on how you stretch that elastic to fit in there. And some are more prominent than others. Like I know my lowest is a 9,
Right.
and my highest is a 3.
Shocking. This is a newsflash.
Right. But, and to that point, I know that, my 7, my 1, and my 8 are also a little bit more prominent for me.
That's right. So that's why it's not about, what's your number and just kind of anchor
Right.
yourself to that number. It's all of these. They're all in you. And part of the work is to learn how to defy your number by, being a little less 3-ish and being a little more 2-ish or whatever your particular work might be. And it's always changing, always adapting. So for a 5 though, and this is why, again, Buffett and some of these others that are on here, core fear is really important. There's some great systems out there. I mean, Michael, you know a lot of them, DISC and Strength Finders and Myers-Briggs. Very few, if any of them that I've discovered, really get into what the Enneagram does, which is your why. What's your why? What's your core motivation? And part of our motivation comes from, what do we fear? We're all human beings. We all have fears. Well, for a 5, the core fear is really not knowing or having enough. And that's, I think, what drives a lot of the investment choices or strategies around a 5. Is that your experience?
It certainly is. It's the quest for knowledge and trying to translate the knowledge into results. Mm-hmm. And like you said, I think that is the differentiator, which is critically important, knowing the why and what you've brought to the system of not just the Enneagram, but the Enneagram plus the why equals what B's brought to Wealth 360 and in general to this massive insight.
Yeah, that why is everything. Frankl, Dr. Viktor Frankl, my mentor, talks about a lot about it. It says, quoting Nietzsche, those who have a why can endure anyhow. And so when you know your why, right, what's driving you, then you can figure out all the hows. And this is especially true with the 5, because 5s live in fear, constant fear, unconsciously most of the time. We're running out of resources, running out of, can be money, but it can be, I imagine they're leading a lot of charges on climate change issues, because I imagine it strikes to the core fear of a 5, probably more than many other types. But that's important to know. And why do I say that? I grew up with an uncle who was a 5, and he was very financially successful, but there was all kinds of lore around him. always being so frugal. He was a multi millionaire. He was so frugal that I was told that he would turn his car off at the top of a hill to coast down it to save gas. He had an old car that didn't have air conditioning because it consumed too much gas. So, it's important to know that fear, if you have the money in the bank, that isn't the issue for a 5 quite often. It's the feeling I'm running out of money. It's oftentimes what drives a 5 to make their choices that they do.
It is a fascinating. I'm dealing with a client who's 95 years old and a 5, and refuses to spend money for home health care assistance, despite the fact of having enormous amounts of wealth to pay for that. And at first, as a 3, and I'm struggling, I'm like, makes no sense. Right? He's not going to run out. He's not going to do this. But 95 years of being a 5 with that fear, he can't open the purse strings, and I'm having difficulty helping with that.
So that's a great example, and the suffering that causes him, but probably his loved ones, right?
That's the most, the children who are, they're not young. I mean, are struggling to deal with it because he doesn't want to pay for help, and they don't all necessarily with their families have time for the help, and so we're trying to help get through to him.
So I think it's just a great example of, well, when you start to know somebody's fear, you can start to help them, alleviate some of those fears, starting to speak to the pain point, because it's different in every type. And what I hear is, and this is what's so amazing about the work you're doing, is you're bringing into a financial conversation an emotional, psychological healing process.
Well, we're trying to. My only problem, of course, is now, yes, I've identified the problem. Now I need you to help me solve it. So what do we do? We're trying to explain to him rationally, because he is a 5. In fact, he's I think a ex-professor. So he's a very analytical guy. I still can't get over the hump even explaining it. So, but at least we've identified the issue. Now we need Obi-Wan Kenobi over here, you, to provide further insight of this almost seems intractable. It's frustrating.
So there's a couple things I would, suggest. I feel like we're doing on air,
this is real life stuff,
therapy.
Right?
This is real life stuff. This is, by the way, for our listeners, this is what Michael and I do. We talk about clients and people that Michael works with financially, so we can best serve them at the deepest level. And, for this gentleman, as a rabbi, I did many, many funerals, and I did 500 funerals, I counted when I retired. And so many people I saw left wealth, generational wealth, but not the deeper components of what they were really trying to get to with that wealth. Nobody just wants to leave a bag of cash. I'd like to leave you with a bag of cash and instructions and, part of my life's mission and message tied to that, so that you can take this gift and do something with it and then hand it off to the next generation. And so I imagine this would speak to somebody like that, where we can reframe it in terms of legacy. And you and I've talked a lot about this, but especially for a 5 teacher type, right? Because 5s tend to be professorial. If not professors, then certainly they feel like professors. And that means they want to teach, that they want to impart not just knowledge, but wisdom. And so I found that getting into legacy conversations about what's really being left behind, right? And starting to tap in, as opposed to a head-on emotional conversation. I don't sense that that's the way to go with a 95-year-old Enneagram 5.
I would definitely agree in the latter part, right? That the emotional part's not going to have any impact, but I like the idea of talking legacy.
Another way to think about this is just data, because I think it's interesting. 5s get very excited when I can show them the data behind the Enneagram. We'll do a whole thing on it sometime where we take out your calculator and you can see this is all mathematics. 5s light up around that. threes tune out, but fives light up. And so I would break down some of this into economics, because if his children, right, really are struggling with how much time and resources can they allocate to take care of their dad, it's actually economically advantageous for them to pay somebody to come in, right? And speaking in his language, in his terms, about the economics of the situation for his children. So I think there are different ways to frame it. I would never have this conversation with last week's type, Enneagram 4, just like I would never have that conversation with this type.
Well, I think that's where you've, like I said, developed something profound, because we're able to customize a particular problem set. And these are difficult problems. They're not easy issues, in help translating it into a language that is helpful. I'm not saying it'll solve everything with one solution, but it helps with a laser beam approach, right?
Yeah, and especially with a type like a 5, because you shared with me a data point a while back that just stuck with me. And it's when people are looking for a financial planner like Michael, I think the data said something like 85% of what they're looking for is non-financial, right? 15% or 5% or whatever it was is financial specific. Is that right?
Well, yeah. As soon as I saw it, we were working on the system, and I was like, wow, these really come across something here, that the behavioral finance part has completely superseded what we used to think of pure return on investment or pure mathematics, when that actually isn't the case anymore. It matters. They're table stakes, right? You have to perform decently for people to keep you. You can't perform badly. That's not the issue. But is that what they're really concerned about? And the answer was no. And I was shocked you weren't, right? You knew the answer before I did, but I was stunned that it was that high, and that was the issue. And it's changed our approach to dealing with things.
So, I would have guessed, though, if I hadn't thought it through, I would have said at least an Enneagram 5, that probably isn't true. They're probably looking for traditional ROI. They probably want to see your return on your portfolio. And I think that would be true at first blush with a 5. But what I hear when you're talking about this gentleman is, the pain and suffering behind those numbers. If you're 95, if you can't have any self-care, wellness involved in the conversation, if you are going to deny yourself a good ending to this lifetime, right? There's a lot of pain and suffering in that I don't think is only data driven.
Yeah, what you say is very interesting, because from the perspective of how you approach each Enneagram based on that statistic of 85%, it probably does make a difference if it's a 2 versus a 5. So you do have to moderate it. So I would agree that he would care more about the return on investment, where a 2 might not be concerned at all, as long as they feel comfortable that you're doing a decent job for them. So I tailor it both now with facts for a 5, which I've learned, with, like you said, these other insights, which I appreciate.
Yes. And so I guess that's, as we start to kind of wrap up our Enneagram 5, the conservative investor, it isn't that there's a pure type where this is all analytics. This person, as an example, is a human being, and we have 3 ways of being in the world. We think, we feel, and we act. The question isn't, do you have all those? The question is, which is your first line of defense?
Right.
Because that's what it comes down to. He's learned how to survive with these tactics, these battlefield tactics. And they may have served him well, but now he's in a different place in his life, and he's still using the same tactics.
But I like your idea of, hey, he's still analytical, so you've got to use the tactics that he's comfortable with. Let's go with the facts. But how to expand that to help him? Because now we're trying to break, I don't want to say bad habits, but we're trying to break a habit of too much conservation. It's gone into the dark side, as you say, probably what you call unintegrated, right? Maybe that you're you're conserving when you don't really have to conserve. For your fear, you're so fearful that you're conserving irrationally, which is kind of counterintuitive for 5 to be irrational, right?
That's right. But that's where he's a human being, and it's not coming from his brain. It's coming from, something deeper, this core fear that we have to address in order to get him to release the grip. Here's a great teaching from the Talmud. It sticks with me, and I think about it quite often. Every baby infant is born into this world with fists clenched tight, screaming. And every corpse leaves this world with your palms open wide. There's no such thing as a corpse with a closed fist. And the goal of life is to learn how to open your hands before life opens them for you. Right. And so if we can help this gentleman leave this world with willingly opening his hands to give to himself, to give to his family by taking care of himself and so forth, it's just a much more beautiful, elegant use of the resources and way to be in this world and leave this world.
I love that. I'll probably explain the Talmud analogy backwards or something, but I'll do my best. I'll have to re-listen to this when we're done.
So I find this is true with fives, and my work with fives is to really help them to just let go and trust, have some faith and in the process and the people around them and the people that are tending to their, their medical health, but also their financial well-being. So my sense is when fives have chosen a financial planner as an example, they've done due diligence. They didn't just pick you out at the yellow pages.
No, they're probably the most due diligence.
Exactly. So if I was working with somebody who's a five, I help them, whatever the issue is, get back to you made the best choice of, I'm certain that you would have and could have. Now you need to trust your financial planner. You need to trust your medical practitioners. You need to trust the people around you. And that's some of the work for a five is to leave the head and kind of come down to the heart. And that's specifically, challenging for a five, but they can do the work. So to all of our fives, that is my encouragement of making that big leap from head to heart, because we know you got it going on up here. We know you have it going on down here in the heart, but also about opening up, sharing, letting go. Any final words for our fives, our conservative investors, or anybody listening?
No, fives are in many ways a pleasure to deal with because they tend to act very rationally and they tend to be very good investors, very receptive to ideas, but the also very, like you said, very matter of fact.
And thank God for them, because we need that objectivity in this world. They can look at both sides. A lot of us talk the talk, but we don't walk the walk of, there's two sides, there's two aisles in politics, as an example. Yeah. Fives tend to be pretty good at navigating that middle ground and having a foot.
I hope there are a lot of fives in the Supreme Court.
I think there are a lot of fives and ones in the Supreme Court. So to all of our fives, thank you. We really appreciate you. And sometimes you get a bad rap like some of the other types, but you really have a tremendous amount to offer this world. And if you're looking for somebody who gets the facts, gets the analytical side, but also is going to help you develop, the emotional side, reach out to my good friend, Michael. He knows what he's doing in that space. And stay tuned for more. So we will talk to you in the next podcast, which will formally be Enneagram number 6, the loyalist. So stay tuned for that one, and also be on the lookout for the Enneagram of Ted Lasso. Take care, mate.
Have a great day.